alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. A very good morning and many thanks, Wunfang, for the kind introduction. It's a great pleasure being invited to give a talk here. And without further ado, let us crack this nut because we all need to eat more nuts. What I will talk about is literally MND in a nutshell. And the things I will go over are some basic backgrounds that might be useful from the perspective of anyone who works either in a district hospital or in a larger center, but may not usually see a lot of MND patients unless you're in a center that is specialized there. So it's just a really broad overview. And obviously, I will have to talk a lot about the diagnosis, the pitfalls in making a diagnosis, and how do we deal with that. I'll cover treatment rather briefly and spend more time on supportive strategies as well as advanced care planning and what is ahead in MND. To begin with, I think it's always helpful if we can relate to patients and the public in general when we talk about motor neuron disease. And the perception is certainly that it's a rare disease, and you may find it difficult to explain about what is MND unless people have some sort of idea. And that is often most effectively kind of illustrated by knowing someone who is prominent and who had it. And that's why it's actually worthwhile just going through a few prominent cases. So most of us would know Stephen Hawking, who sadly deceased several years ago and has lived for many years with motor neuron disease. In that sense, he's a non-typical case where disease progressed slowly, but nevertheless, he really astonished the whole world with what he achieved despite his very advanced disease, being wheelchair bound, eventually being ventilated and communicating through the synthetic voice that has become so famous. And most importantly, I suppose, maintaining his sense of humor that is dearly missed by everyone. Above him here, you see Tony Judt, who passed away, I think, in 2010, and who was brilliant writer in politics, history. And I would urge you to listen to an interview he gave about his disease, but also if you look for it online, there's a very impressive lecture he gave on, sadly, the decline of social democracy, but impressively, really amazingly, he gave that lecture while being on non-invasive ventilation. And it's just really sad for the decline of social democracy and having lost Tony Judt. Next to him, you see Stephen Hillenburg, whose gift to the world was SpongeBob SquarePants. And I think our evenings and weekends would be much poorer if it weren't for SpongeBob. And below here, you see Muqtada Hari, who I would be curious to know, perhaps later, if we took a poll, how many of you might know him. He is a shining figure from the better days of Malaysian football. Until now, he is number 3 in the top scoring ranking of footballers having played national matches. And he's really been an icon until having passed away from MND. I don't quite remember the year. To the right here, you see a German painter who is very famous for having been probably one of the greatest German artists in the second half of the 20th century, and who very much kept going as well, even being wheelchair bound, even being on a tracheostomy. He continued his painting, albeit he had an assistant whom he instructed how to paint. It was very inspiring to watch him as well. And last but not least, I should mention Lou Gehrig, who is very beloved to Americans in particular, having been probably the greatest baseball player in all time, and who gave a very emotional speech on leaving professional baseball. And at the time, having been informed about his diagnosis, he shared it with the public, and he's really famous for those words of his, which were that I have an awful lot to live for. And that's when he quit baseball. So you can see that in a way, it's really helpful if you can relate to some personality of MND. And from a public point of view, it makes sense that they know what is MND, how it affects people. And very importantly, the point showing all these pictures is really how great things people have achieved despite MND. And obviously you would wonder, so many guys, where are the girls? There is a male preponderance for sure, but to be honest, I think we just need to do more research, and there were a few examples, but I didn't manage to put them up. I also like to quote here the very eminent UK neurologist who said, the best test of a physician's suitability for the specialized practice of neurology is not his ability to memorize improbable syndromes, but whether he can continue to support a case of motor neuron disease and keep the patient, his relatives, and himself in a reasonably cheerful frame of mind. Now, being a palliative physician for most of my time, of course, this is music in my ears, finding out that indeed to qualify in neurology really takes a lot of palliative care skills, but notably also, I think we've moved on from the time where everyone was on their own, more or less, in a specialty of neurology, of palliative care. And we've moved on to working together. So really it's, I would say, the test of a team is being able to look after a case of motor neuron disease and keeping the patient cheerful. And also of note is that Cicely Saunders, who is probably known to many for having pioneered palliative care, is also quoted as having said that MND is the worst disease, really. So there certainly is a very particular need for care and demand for the attention of skilled physicians to dedicate themselves to the care of MND patients. Now I go into some basics, so just that we get an idea what it all is happening in motor neuron disease, because often it's sort of enigmatic, one of the many differentials in neurology that we consider rare as compared to strokes and Parkinson's disease. So reasonably, you may not dedicate as much time in medical school to learning about it, but nevertheless, as we'll see, it is not a rare disease, and there is, in fact, a systematic approach to it that you can use for sort of having a good mental image and remembering, well, what's going on in terms of pathophysiology in motor neuron disease. And very remarkably, even in the second half of the 19th century, Jean-Martin Charcot in Paris made a few very detailed observations that really speak to the meticulousness of physicians at the time, and also to how they gained an understanding from doing post-mortem in many patients. And what he described were several patients with the following conditions: paralysis with spasms, or in other words, increased tone or increased reflexes, principally in the legs, without any loss of sensation, together with progressive amyotrophy, also known as wasting, which was confined mostly to the upper limbs and trunk. So there we have it. Even 100 years and more ago, it was really finely observed that this is an entity in its own. As we'll see, the picture has gotten much, much more complex, but until now, it has remained useful to think about MND, motor neuron disease, as a condition affecting upper and lower motor neurons, and therefore giving you wasting as well as increased reflexes, spasticity at the same time. And just to recap, there's this nice diagram here from the New England Journal where you can recapitulate the anatomy of motor neurons originating in the right motor cortex in this case, then traveling all the way either to the medulla and then on towards the bulbar facial nerves, or else for the case of spinal, corticospinal tracts traveling even farther until the anterior horn cell, where the upper motor neuron synapses onto the lower motor neuron. And if you wonder, how is it that these cells would degenerate? Of course, we are aware there is such a phenomenon as neurodegeneration affecting other neurons as well. But in a broad sense, it probably helps to think of it as being related to the fact that motor neurons really achieve great feat by functioning throughout a lifetime and being really marvelous cells in terms of their structure and function. As you remember, their axons stretch all the way from the motor cortex to the anterior horn, so hence being extremely elongated cells. And as I can imagine, there's obviously a lot of fine molecular machinery that is involved in keeping these cells functioning and keeping them alive, very importantly, throughout someone's lifetime. So it's basically an example of a very complex and sophisticated part of cellular anatomy, which, because of this complexity, is prone to degeneration. So just to give a brief overview of what is happening at the cellular level, of course, it can get very involved and complex quickly. But broadly speaking, the understanding of motor neuron disease has evolved. So with all the new methodology that we have, we can now do a very advanced genetic analysis. There are very sophisticated microscopic staining techniques. Immunology has advanced, and also especially cellular biology has contributed a great deal to understanding the exact details of MND pathophysiology. So broadly speaking, it can be divided into abnormalities in the protein homeostasis, in the RNA metabolism, in the transport of neurotransmitters contained in vesicles, breakdown of the exon structure, abnormalities in the DNA repair, excitotoxicity, neuroinflammation, oligodendrocyte involvement, as well as mitochondrial dysfunction. So indeed, there's a very complex picture, which is kind of represented by the different genes that are involved at particular cellular levels of functioning here. And so basically what you see is here the the translation of DNA to RNA, which then needs to be exported into the cytoplasm in order for protein synthesis to proceed. And also there has to be a very well balanced and functioning homeostasis of proteins, which usually depends on a process called ubiquitination. So it's the marking of proteins for recycling basically in the proteasomes that you see here. And if that goes wrong, then it can often be an element in MND. And for what goes wrong at the cellular level, just to show you a few images. For example, one of the proteins that you will read about is TDP43, which is characteristically in a lot of MND cases mislocalizing. So if you see this bold arrow here, there's a distribution of TDP inside the nucleus, and in this neuron, on the contrary, there's a mislocalization of TDP43 in the cytoplasm, which is one of many processes leading to neuron death. Then you have neurofilament accumulation as well, shown here with a bold arrow affecting a neuron. And as the final pathway in the pathology, you find that in the anterior horn cell, there is eventually death of neurons. So, but what these two slides, D and E, show you is that D is basically just an illustration of anterior horn cell without practically any motor neurons that stain, and E would be the physiological appearance where you can see the nicely staining cell bodies of the anterior horn motor neurons. And also relevant is here you see a CD68 stain for immunostaining to show that there's neuroinflammation affecting the lateral tract here as well. So you can visualize that with the new methods, basically. Another part that is helpful to understand is what happens at the level of the nerves and the muscle itself. And this is nicely illustrated here, where you can see a cross-section of muscle under the microscope, as well as a schematic drawing of what happens as the nerve input from the lower motor neurons is lost. So essentially, you imagine there's a motor unit that is degenerating. Hence, there will be no further input from the spine to that motor unit, and that would be the process called denervation. And the response to that over time would be a second process called reinnervation, whereby motor units eventually will develop synapses with other surviving motor units that then come to innervate a larger number of motor units. So if you imagine that previously you had two separate motor units being innervated by by separate nerve fibers, then as one fiber dies off, the other fiber effectively will take over innervation of the other muscle fibrils that were previously innervated. And hence on the electromyography, you can see that there will be larger potentials if you do a proper EMG, and that is very helpful in the diagnosis. As for the genetic understanding, the picture is indeed very complex. And just to summarize, perhaps, we could say that, broadly speaking, the majority of MND cases will be so-called sporadic cases, where you do not have a obvious family history of MND in this patient's family. And a rather small proportion of about 10% of cases has been thought to be familial or has been labeled as familial MND. And those patients in general tend to be younger and have first-degree relatives, and therefore being labeled as familial MND. As we will see later, there's a bit of a problem with this dichotomy, and that relates to the fact that MND is not that rare, and depending on how large a pedigree you are able to draw, the likelihood of identifying patients with MND will be different. So for example, if in Malaysia, as we usually do, we are aware of our extended families, then the likelihood should be much higher that there is another identifiable case of MND, as compared to a case where someone really doesn't know their ancestry, their living relatives much beyond the core family, perhaps. And as you see here, throughout the years, new genes have been discovered at an exponential rate. Every 4 years, the number of genes that are known in a way to be associated with MND doubles. Every 4 years, we know twice as many genes. And interestingly, they seem to be related to different cellular functions. And in many cases, it's really the genome-wide association studies that are done to identify these genes without any much more detailed understanding of the function of these genes, other than that they are related to MND. But once again, when we consider the genes, broadly speaking, they are involved either in the protein homeostasis, RNA binding, or the cytoskeletal proteins. And if, once again, talking about this dichotomy between the familial or the sporadic ALS, it's important that even in sporadic ALS, which I will use synonymously with MND, even in sporadic MND, the heritability is thought to be 60%. So what does that mean? If you look at homozygote twins, you would find that they do have a higher likelihood of MND affecting both twins as compared with dizygote twins. So that suggests that even there is certainly a heritability component, but even in the homozygote twins, it's not the case that in every patient who has MND and a homozygote twin, the other twin will be affected. In fact, even among that population of homozygote twins, it's still a minority where both twins are affected. And notably, even though there are genes related to MND identifiable in sporadic cases, it does mean that the risk of a first-degree relative being affected based on that is still very low. So it just goes from perhaps 98 to 95 % likelihood of not having MND, i.e. if someone's first-degree relative had MND, it does a very tiny change to one's risk of developing MND, but it's in the range of very, very few %. Interestingly, there are clearly demonstrable, or rather, there has always been a discussion around what is the potential influence of the environment on developing MND. And in some cases, there has been exposure to certain industrial toxins, environmental toxins, where clusters of MND seem to have occurred in a statistically significant manner. And that has been a puzzling factor for many years, where until now, there is no very well established single environmental risk factors, but there are very many potential environmental risk factors that have been identified that are being investigated without any one of them being extremely suggestive as the main cause of MND. So for example, there's a certain exposure to algae in the environment, and employment in the armed forces has been found to be associated with MND, geographical clustering, smoking. And the issue with all these with all these environmental factors is that you could always question, is it truly an environmental factor, or could it be that someone who has served in the armed forces is just being followed up more regularly and therefore has a higher likelihood of being diagnosed? Or is it that there are other confounders which are difficult to identify? And what has emerged, interestingly, is a pattern of epidemiological data that supports a so-called step model in the causation of motor neuron disease. And this goes back to when cancer was initially investigated for its causes, and it was found that with increasing age, the incidence of cancer increased. And what was done in the case of cancer was that the incidence in numbers per 100,000 per year was plotted on a logarithmic scale over the age, basically. Sorry, these are unlabeled axes, but you can discover from plotting the incidence of the disease over the age that this linear pattern results. And that is initially observed in cancer and led to the multi-stage theory of cancer, whereby it was recognized there are certain steps, discrete single steps occurring and eventually leading to causation of cancer after having crossed a threshold beyond which cancer became very likely and indeed occurred. And likewise in MND, if we plot this incidence over the age, so for example, how many patients develop MND in their third, fourth, fifth decade of life, if we plot that on a logarithmic scale, we also get this linear graph suggesting that indeed, MND arises out of an accumulation of different steps that lead to the eventual manifestation of motor neuron disease. And these steps, briefly, you can summarize as genetic, age or time, and environment. Thus, you could say there is a certain genetic burden that everyone is born with in terms of their genetic profile. There are some genes that are very common in the general population and that are statistically significantly more common in MND patients and therefore considered risk factors for MND, but they may not cause MND on their own. But as time goes by, as aging affects the cellular function, another risk factor emerges, and also the environment plays a role. So the hypothesis is that indeed there are these different steps that eventually cause to a threshold being crossed and people developing the manifest motor neuron disease. And as for the incidence in Asia, just to show you a graph here, you can see the incidence would be between 0.5 in Taiwan and a rather high 2.7 in Australia. Broadly speaking, it's quite uniform around the world. Obviously, the quality of data will depend on the research network that is recording data. And just to give you a figure from our own center here in Malaysia, from January 2015 until June the next year, we've looked at 144 patients and found a crude incidence of 0.53 per 100,000. But the incidence in the age group of 60 to 74 was 2 per 100,000, somewhat more in line with the international figures. The median survival was about 2.5 years. But really, it might be helpful looking at these figures in a different way. And for example, it has been calculated that of all the people alive in the US now, an estimated 800,000 persons will develop ALS. And also, it could be calculated eventually the lifetime risk is somewhere around 1 in 400. So hence, the next time you're on a long haul flight, likelihood is that someone in a lifetime would develop ALS, or similarly, if you consider maybe your primary school buddies throughout all the grades, there is very likely someone in your cohort, however you want to define it. And the basic calculation that we can do in epidemiology is to arrive at a prevalence by taking the incidence, in this case, 3 to 5 per 100,000, and multiplying it by the duration, which is obviously the survival in most cases of ALS. And then just as a rough estimate, when I looked up this morning for Malaysia's 32 million, perhaps one might crudely estimate the number of cases to be in the region of 1,000 patients that are having ALS, MND at any time, and very notably also that have MND for the time that they are diagnosed until eventually they pass away. So there's a population that is rapidly changing. And for a Kaplan-Meier plot here, you can glean from this graph that there's also heterogeneity in the survival patterns according to what subtype of ALS is diagnosed, and we'll get to that in a bit. But generally speaking, primary lateral sclerosis has the comparatively better survival, and you can see that it does go into 200 months, many years, even 50% of patients might survive until this 200 months mark, whereas bulbar onset ALS has the characteristically poorer survival here in the Kaplan-Meier plot. For the clinical presentation of MND, as I mentioned before, the key hallmark is the involvement of upper and lower motor neurons. That being said, this is a very variable presentation in many cases where you see different patterns emerging based on whether it is a predominantly upper motor neuron or lower motor neuron involvement. Broadly speaking, you might remember as a takeaway from today that the location of onset would be bulbar in about a third, so hence presenting with dysarthria or dysphagia. About 2/3 will have limb onset, usually asymmetrical in the upper or lower limbs, and rather few, 5% or less, will have respiratory onset to begin with. There's a clear overlap between FTD, frontotemporal dementia, reported as up to 50%, but that is, let me put it differently. The majority of patients do not have any clear evidence of frontotemporal dementia, but there is a clear overlap, and that can be identified in a variable proportion of patients, different numbers being quoted, but it could be up to even 1/3. And frontotemporal dementia obviously is a special challenge in caring for patients with motor neuron disease, because it means that the approach to decision-making and advanced care planning needs to take into account that they may have frontotemporal dementia. One useful feature in assessing patients is the split hand pattern of wasting, whereby there is more pronounced wasting over the tena eminence, the lateral side of the hand, which compared to the medial side is thought to be a reflection of the cortical organization of the motor neurons. There may be head drop. So head drop is a fairly specific way that MND may present with few other differentials perhaps, and should not be attributed to cervical spondylosis. So head drop is a possible presentation, and likewise the pseudo-bulbar effect that can be associated with facial spasticity and inappropriate laughter or inappropriate crying that is observed in some patients. Usually there is no substantial autonomic involvement, and very importantly in the clinical presentation, there is usually no sensory involvement. I do recommend to have a look at this article especially, which is a brilliant summary of mimics and chameleons in motor neuron disease, and dividing up into lower motor neuron and upper motor neuron disease. I'd just like to point out a few. So benign fasciculations. I think a lot of us may have experienced fasciculations after exercising, after having had too much caffeine, or in otherwise unremarkable circumstances. So interestingly, I think it would be likely doctors who are worried about fasciculations being a symptom of MND. Commonly, we find that patients are not really, even very often, they may not be aware of fasciculations, even though they may be very obvious. So fasciculations a lot of time are benign, and the main caveat to that is in the absence of weakness. Once again, a key element in assessing someone with a possible diagnosis of MND is to look for weakness and wasting. So that wouldn't be seen in benign fasciculations. Then there is an entity called multifocal motor neuropathy with conduction block, which can be diagnosed on neurophysiological testing, and which may respond to intravenous immunoglobulins, and which may generally progress slower. Neuralgic amyotrophy is another differential. Kennedy syndrome is a genetic disorder, a trinucleotide repeat expansion that is affecting the androgen receptor, associated with gynecomastia, being inherited in an X recessive manner, hence affecting male patients, but progressing very slowly. Then there's motor predominant CIDP, inclusion body myositis. As you can see here, far fewer upper motor neuron diseases being a differential in MND, and I won't talk much in detail. This is a helpful slide to illustrate the diagnostic journey that patients usually travel before a diagnosis is made. So as you can see, they will likely have some symptoms such as tripping over objects, sometimes not being able to turn the car key if you don't have a button to turn on engines as is common nowadays. But basically there's a lot of time, a history where patients are initially observing motor deficit that they perceive as minor, and hence there's some time lost until they initially present to a general practitioner. This can be 1 or 2 months. Obviously, denial can be a feature in that as well. And then somewhat regrettably, even from the time that general practitioners see until general neurologists or MND neurologists see the patients, there is a further loss of time, which obviously can be explained by the fact that we are extremely reluctant to falsely diagnose motor neuron disease because of the grave implications of it. And hence, it has been suggested there's a tendency that doctors might be looking for alternatives diagnosis potentially for a little bit too long. And that is a problem because as time is lost, there's lost opportunity to improve the patient's quality of life, and also it can undermine the patient's confidence in the treating doctors if the diagnosis is really delayed too much. And having said that, of course, one can ask which are the mandatory investigations that should be done, and as this article suggests, there may not be any mandatory investigations really, based on the fact that motor neuron disease is a clinical diagnosis, which experienced practitioners can make with a reasonable level of confidence once it has progressed to a certain degree, even without doing extensive investigations such as MRI and nerve conduction studies and electromyograms. But of course, it's essential to be aware of the differential diagnosis. Just that it's also important to identify those symptoms that are very suggestive of MND and not delay the diagnosis any further. Okay, this is essentially covering what I mentioned just now. So in terms of the literature, if you read up, there's the El Escorial criteria, which I think is a place in Spain where initially this was drawn up. And they are mainly useful in terms of research because we need to be sure that patients enrolled in MND studies do indeed have a diagnosis of MND. And that will be involving the presence of motor neuron degeneration on electrophysiological or neuropathological examination, evidence of upper motor neuron degeneration, progression within a region or spread to other regions. So regions in this context are spinal, bulbar, and respiratory regions. And notably, there has to be absence of other evidence suggesting other pathology or even neuroimaging evidence to suggest other processes. Then there are these categories where it has been suggested to label ALS as definite if it is involving 3 regions with upper and lower motor neuron involvement, and suspected if it is only lower motor neuron signs in 2 regions. Just as a short overview, you will see that in research settings, we are assessing the stage of ALS in terms of the ALS functional rating scale. And while you don't have to memorize it, it's certainly very helpful to structure your approach to supporting the patient. So you have the bulbar components: speech, salivation, swallowing, handwriting, cutting food, dressing and hygiene, turning in bed, walking, climbing stairs as gross motor features. Then on the respiratory side, dyspnea, orthopnea, and respiratory insufficiency. So as you see patients in clinical practice, you will come across these patterns. For example, salivation being very bothersome in some patients, where you find that even the first time you see them, they always carry a tissue with them to dry up extra saliva that they have. And with regards to swallowing, they can have various degrees of difficulty with swallowing. Yeah, fine motor handwriting, cutting food, all of these are very relevant to the patient's function. For treatment of MND, there's obviously a lot of research going on, and there have been rather few breakthroughs in the past. And the ones to be aware of are riluzole, which is thought to reduce glutamatergic neurotransmission and has a somewhat modest effect on the disease progression, really modest slowing of the disease, slightly improving the survival at the expense of a very high cost and also potentially liver toxicity. The main caveat is the cost, really. Yeah? And likewise with edaravone being discovered later than riluzole, tentatively an antioxidant, it has been proven in some studies to be beneficial. And I think what is the lesson learned in the therapeutic trials is that when patients are receiving treatment, it matters a great deal what exact pathophysiology that is underlying in terms of the genetic factors, especially. So, for example, is it a patient who has this SOT1 mutation, or is it a different mutation? And that very much can predict the potential benefit of different treatments. So in summary, in future, there'll be more of this precision medicine, if you will, where it really needs a very detailed, even genetic diagnosis to know what treatments are likely beneficial in patients, rather than just lumping everything together in motor neuron disease. As a resource to direct your patients to, I can recommend alsuntangled.com, which is a group of neurologists and other ALS researchers who are regularly publishing reviews of available evidence about all sorts of treatments, potential treatments, and even non-official or complementary treatments, which are anecdotally helpful, or which are even just being promoted on the basis of some rare observations among non-medical circles, for example. This is a very useful resource. And for supportive measures, I think this is the key for us to focus on, perhaps, that, as Lou Gehrig said, there is an awful lot to live for in his case. And what can we do for helping these patients live that which they have to live for? And especially, for example, I noticed the ALS Association in the US has this statement that they said that while MND is not curable, it can be transformed into a livable disease. So despite the psychosocial suffering or the spiritual distress, there are these interventions that do make a difference to the patient's quality of life. And for those patients who are interested in them and who are potentially benefiting, it's, I think, very important that we do provide them to them. So broadly speaking, immobility is a major issue in ALS, and that needs a very personalized approach in terms of rehab, getting involved occupational therapy as well. Bulbar symptoms are distressing: sleep disturbance, dyspnea, cognitive symptoms, spasticity, and especially pain is important. So all of these really need to be assessed systematically, and also with a very open mind to the possibility that patients may be affected in extremely different ways. So for some patients, as I mentioned before, if they had a predominantly bulbar involvement, they might even be ambulating. They might not have a mobility issue, but they can have bulbar symptoms. And that is something where I think we had a few specialized sessions in MND Beyond Borders, which we can recapitulate. So that's how you would approach symptoms. And most efficiently, it is done in a multidisciplinary team that will involve a neurologist, allied health, chest team, rehab, gastropalliative, and even others. So for example, depending on what are the needs, you may even have to do, for example, I will get to it in a moment. We might have to do PEC tube insertions sometimes that need the NS team to be involved. Or you might have patients where the siloria is so refractory, so difficult to manage that you might have to get a radiotherapy done for them. To just keep an open mind that there may be other specialties worth involving and very worth involving in the care of MND. One thing that I think we have opportunity to discuss and exchange after this is NIV. NIV since 2006 has been proven in a landmark trial to be beneficial. Ever since then, it has become the standard of care. So the new standard of care is that patients should be offered non-invasive ventilation, which improves the quality of life as well as the survival. But having said that, there are caveats. And even in patients with bulbar disease, where one might think that non-invasive ventilation is difficult because of the swallowing problems, because of the spasticity, there has been proven to be improved survival. And even though it was counterintuitive, it is worth noting. Now, what is especially important is to consider NIV as a very tailored supportive measure. So as you can see, there's a huge variety of different interfaces that patients can wear. And really, unless the patient has a chance to try and really find out which interface that is the most suitable for them, we may not do well by just offering them one interface and then considering that either successful or a failure. You really have to pay a lot of attention to details in NIV, and one of them is the mask, that the interface has to be appropriate. And I won't go into a great deal of detail here, but perhaps to say that the indications for NIV have somewhat evolved. It used to be something which was used rather late in earlier years, where patients were already very advanced. And it has now been found to benefit patients even at earlier stages, especially if they have symptoms related to sleep. So even without a sleep study, if there are very prominent symptoms such as orthopnea and very poor sleep, non-restorative sleep, then it's very worthwhile to consider whether the patient may benefit from non-invasive ventilation. Obviously, there's a great amount of time that needs to be dedicated to really introducing NIV in a way that's appropriate to the patient. Letting patients acclimatize very gradually to NIV such that they can be empowered to operate it themselves, to decide for themselves what really is the role that they expect from it, the help that they expect from it, and give them the freedom to use and remove NIV at any time that they want. And thankfully, NIV devices here shown 2 examples have also evolved to become very much portable, battery powered, and lightweight, so they can be carried around on wheelchairs, can even be carried around on planes. They can plug into car batteries with the adapters. So it's really a huge jump in being able to support patients with respiratory involvement. Another thing that is also important, which a previous MND Beyond Borders has touched on, is secretion management. But since we're talking about MND in a nutshell, do be aware that it's not only difficulty breathing and a sleep study result that needs you to act, but it's also important to consider what happens to the secretions as the disease progresses, because very crucially, if the respiratory reserve is compromised, patients not being able to take a deep breath in, then intuitively their cough will be compromised, and hence the likelihood of infections increase. So even before or along with introducing non-invasive ventilation, it's very important to assess the patient's cough and consider the options that we have in terms of supporting their cough, which can be quite low-tech, such as breath stacking techniques, or which can involve medical devices such as MIE, mechanical insufflation, exsufflation. Another very important aspect to address is nutrition, and that is relevant because patients are losing weight, which is a poor prognostic sign and also distressing to patients. And I think very importantly is to explore. And for example, one of the questions that is useful to ask is obviously what sort of diet are they taking? And also very importantly, how long do they take to finish their meals? So often, unless we ask, patients may not initially share that perhaps taking their breakfast has suddenly come to take them half an hour or 1 hour. And obviously that is distressing. That needs them to use up a lot of energy, which can be avoided through enteral feeding. But interestingly and importantly, even other than feeding tubes, it's important to pay attention to the details of their diet. So for example, the normal recommended balanced adult diet doesn't serve a patient with MND very well because the consistency is an issue to them. It may not be easy to swallow, and also the amount of calories that they obtain from the volume of food that they need to swallow is not optimal. So as you can see here, those are very calorie dense foods and also very protein rich foods. I think it's a salmon, egg, avocado, all of these foods, they do give you a real burst of protein and lipids. So basically calories and proteins that are packaged in a way that is suitable for patients. And I will share with you the link to this cookbook, which is released by the MND Association from the UK, and which has a lot of very nice recipes that you can try yourself and that look really delicious. I think on a side note, it's really worth trying them. And that may well be an option which some patients may choose at the time when they are not keen for enteral feeding, but yet they do want to optimize their nutrition. So do talk about that with them. If patients are agreeable for a PEG tube, a percutaneous enterocutaneous gastrostomy, then it's very important to plan ahead how the procedure will be done. And that is because their risk during the procedure is very much increased according to how severe is their respiratory involvement. So for example, what we've been using in UM, for example, is this traffic light stratification of patients according to respiratory parameters. How high is their per procedure, peri-procedural risk during the PEG tube insertion? And then you may either find that it's quite reasonably safe to proceed with a PEG tube insertion, or sometimes you may have to reconsider whether is it worth putting a PEG tube in someone where the likelihood is they would not be able to saturate during the procedure, so hence running a risk of requiring invasive ventilation. So that's a complex decision, and it needs the involvement of at least neurologist, gastroenterologist, and very crucially an anesthesiologist who is interested and keen in this. And on towards occupational and physiotherapy, is very important to be aware of what are the different options that patients have. So for example, here you see one patient who was a very savvy IT user and who really has, I think, the optimum gear here: a motorized wheelchair, a customized cushion, a neck rest, and an eye tracker that is mounted to the wheelchair. Sadly, depending on what are your resources, this is something where you have to improvise a lot of the time. But from the patient's point of view, it's really worth every cent and every minute that you spend in making it a customized solution that really fits their needs, and that helps them to go about the things that they live for. and also that helps them to preserve energy. And really important also, for example, you see patients walking around with neck collars of all types, aspen collars, or kinds of rigid collars that are really uncomfortable to wear in the long run, as you can try yourself. And if you consider what they need really is something to counter the neck drop, the head drop. So they don't need something to restrict their movement, but they need something to support the neck. And for that, for example, there's one device here that is commercially available, a bit costly, the so-called headmaster collar, which doesn't restrict the movement much and yet supports the chin. So it's very helpful. So that's about equipment. And another very important aspect of care, which is sadly missed, is intimacy. So obviously, there's a bit of reluctance to in anyone to discuss matters relating to intimacy, and especially if there's a life limiting illness such as MND. But it's extremely important pointing out that, as we mentioned before, MND is affecting motor neurons. It does not affect sensation, and patients do often, until a very late stage, retain the ability to enjoy intimacy if there is a frank discussion that they have about it, and they are aware of that fact that MND does not mean that they have to abstain from intimacy. So it's very important to have that discussion, man to man, woman to woman, and make sure that patients do not miss out the quality of life there. Communication, likewise, I like to call it a low-hanging fruit in terms of improving the patient's quality of life, because really the most horrible aspect for many patients is not being able to communicate. And as the disease progresses, just settling into this state where they can't speak their mind. And you can imagine the distress that comes with not being able to mention what are your preferences, what do you even think about having this particular treatment. So the distress is not being able to talk, and at the same time being very much able to think clearly, and also having all this desire, as we do, to speak our mind as we usually do. And one of the very effective ways that you can communicate in MND is using eye movements. So shown here on the left is a so-called e-tran board, which is just a very smart way to communicate, where you just have to print the letters in an arrangement like shown here onto a piece of paper. And then by cutting out the middle here, you get a frame that is put between the two communication partners. And then the patient would look in a direction that corresponds to the letter they intend to spell. And that lets their communication partners guess, or rather establish which letter they intend to spell. So that is an example of a low-tech communication method. And to be very honest, you are likely stunned if you see how effective some patients can be at that, because it's really mind-boggling to see, if you have a chance to see someone who has grown accustomed to that, do well with it. They can literally spell letters at a blazing speed, and they find it helpful, and it doesn't need anything other than a piece of paper to communicate even the most abstract thoughts, and to convey basic needs, to share emotion, and really for all purposes to stay the person that you were, and a member of the family and the environment that people were. So it's really as easy as that. And hopefully in future we'll have another MND BB session on communication. On the other hand, in recent years, the high-tech solutions have proliferated. There's been the traditional eye tracker mounted on a laptop or a pad personal computer. So that works very well for patients, albeit they will need to be positioned appropriately. Patient here is seated, or else you will have to make sure that once again you customize the arrangement of the position of the patient. So for example, in this case, not necessarily related to MND, but it really pays to be creative in finding the ways to position oneself comfortably. Okay, and last but not least, another very important aspect in managing MND, whenever you are involved in MND management, is advanced care planning. So really, advanced care planning is a process where patients, caregivers, and the clinical team is in a conversation, is always exchanging their views based on shared decision-making. Patients are offered information, offered different choices, and in a shared manner, the team and patients and caregivers decide what are their preferences, what sorts of treatments would they like, a tracheostomy or not, a PEG tube or not, a certain mobility aid or not. And very importantly, this advanced care planning is a process. It's never set and forget. It's never a matter of ticking a box and then leaving it at that, but it's really a matter of, at every turn of the disease, sitting down together and finding out what are the things that matter to the patient and what are the decisions that will best fit with the things that matter to them. It's a team approach, and it needs continuity. So what's the future in MND for MND Beyond Borders? We are certainly hoping that there will be many more opportunities to learn from each other, find out what are the creative ways that we've found to make MND a livable disease for patients in Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia. Look for what can be the role of palliative care and other specialties, build the networks, involve as many specialties as possible. It's always amazing how much more you can offer patients once you get your colleague involved who is good in that other field. And also embracing technology, finding out how things have moved along. And they certainly do move very fast with regards to technology these days. Quality of life is something which notoriously is difficult to measure, because everyone might think something else important in their life. Everything else, everyone else has a slightly different preference what matters to them. But nevertheless, from a public health perspective, it would matter that we can show that quality of life is improved by our activities. And thankfully that has been done. And also research is important, staying up to date with what are the advances in research, and also being aware that there's a lot that we can contribute to research in terms of epidemiological studies, maintaining MND databases, and hence providing all those billions of data points that may well in time to come be the resource from which new treatments will come. So that's for research. Here are online resources, and finally, here are my references. And if you scan the QR, then you can download them.